What's up, viewers? Patrick from Bob vs. Only back in interviews, episode number 5 of Plans Week on Bob verse of the day. And today's verse comes out of Romans 8:28, and it says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." And that's what that verse means. Let's get into it. Continuing with the road home, God's plan for Christian growth. This is chapter 6, and it is titled Grace and Power. In the Battle of Imjin River during the Korean War, thousands of communist soldiers overwhelmed the position of a British regiment of 600 men. As the battle unfolded, the British commander could see that his troops were in deep trouble. Serving in a United Nations force, the British general contacted his American superior to report the situation. Famously, his report was that the situation was a bit sticky. The British commander meant that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Tragically, the American general did not grasp the metaphor, taking it to mean that the Brits were holding their own. He ordered them to stand their ground. 4 days later, after a legendary battle, the enemy overran the glorious Gloucesters. As our discussion of grace has shown, misunderstanding this biblical term can cause confusion to overrun the Christian life. In the New Testament, grace includes more than the Father's kind intention and the Son's work on the cross. It includes the indwelling of the Spirit, through whom the overcoming life of the risen Lord inhabits believers. The sharper picture we have of the work of grace within us, the better we can respond. We trust more easily what we understand well, and we better discern false paths if we recognize the right one. To gain clearer perspective, we need to meditate further on the operation of the Spirit of grace. The power of grace in ministry. Paul sees grace as the power energizing his ministry of his apostleship. He writes, this is 1 Corinthians 15 verse 10, and it says, "But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me." Paul's first line, "By the grace of God I am what I am," should get our attention. A hero of Christian faith hands out the key to his ministry. The grace of God, but what does Paul mean by grace? In English, the claim to be something by the grace of God often means God has somehow orchestrated good circumstances that have contributed positively to a person's position in life. An example of this providential interpretation of the phrase appears on the dedicatory page of the 1611 King James Version of the Bible, which acknowledges James to be King of Great Britain by the grace of God. Reading the dedication, we discover that James takes the throne in a time of national uncertainty, and everyone breathes a sigh of relief that God in his providence has favored the land with a stable leader. Reading Paul's statements with this sort of providential understanding of the phrase, "by the grace of God," we are likely to misunderstand him to be saying, God has ordered the circumstances of my life to work out in a way that allows me to be this great apostle. That is not what Paul means. The next line helps us get the right idea. Paul writes, "His grace toward me was not in vain." The phrase "not in vain" signifies failure. Grace does not fail in Paul's life. What God means grace to accomplish in Paul is happening as God intends. The grace of God at work in Paul is effective. This implies that grace here is more than God's acceptance, forgiveness, or inscrutable orchestration of events. It is the inner working of the divine power of God's Spirit energizing Paul's life and ministry. That interpretation holds up as we read the rest of the verse. Grace, Paul writes, makes him more vigorous in ministry than any other apostle. I work harder than any of them. It might seem an arrogant claim, Paul stating so boldly that he does more apostolistic labor than his peers. Lest anyone mistakenly hear pride in his comments, he makes it clear that his work does not originate from himself, to his claim. I worked harder than any of them, he adds, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Paul's disclaimer of credit underlines the source of his apostolistic ministry. The power that propels him forward is not his own will or marvelous ingenuity. It is divinely imparted grace. Grace appears again as God's enabling power in Galatians, where Paul recalls a conference with the apostles in Jerusalem, at which he described his ministry. They recognize how Paul's spearheading of the Gentile mission complemented Peter's ministry to the circumcised, the Jews. They concluded that Paul and Peter were point men for reaching these two people groups because it was clear Jesus was working powerfully through both. Paul explains, for he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. What did this powerful working of Jesus and Paul's ministry look like? In Romans, specifically chapter 15, verse 18 through 19, Paul gives us a picture. For I will not venture to speak of anything except what Christ has accomplished through me to bring the Gentiles to obedience. By word and deed, by the power of signs and wonders, by the power of the Spirit of God, so that from Jerusalem and all the way around in Illyricum, I have fulfilled the ministry of the gospel of Christ. Paul ministered by the power of signs and wonders, by the power of the Spirit of God. In Galatians, after explaining how the Jerusalem church leaders recognized this power of Jesus working in him, Paul sums up what those leaders saw. He states that they perceived the grace that was given to me, as in 1 Corinthians 15:10. Paul expresses the divine power enabling his ministry in a single term, grace. We have seen then in three passages, 1 Corinthians 15:10, Romans 15:18 through 19, and Galatians 2:8 and 9, that Paul attributes his apostolic work to God's power at work in him. In two of these passages, he defines that divine power, which he elsewhere speaks of as Jesus at work in him. Using the term grace, he speaks of grace this way again, introducing his letter to the Romans. Paul uses grace as a synonym for the power of divine enablement through Christ. He writes, he and his co-workers, this is Romans 1 verse 5, have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith, for the sake of his name among all the nations. The term grace and apostleship are nearly equivalent here. Both refer to Christ's empowering of Paul's effort to call all the nations to obey the gospel. We find a similar overlap of grace and power in Luke's writings. Luke writes that in the earliest days of the church, the apostles preached the gospel with great power, and that the whole church was experiencing great grace. Luke tells of Stephen, a deacon who was full of grace and power, and was doing great wonders and signs among the people. Barnabas, having come to Antioch, saw the grace of God, meaning he witnessed the many Gentiles who had converted from paganism and become faithful followers of Jesus. Luke's description of the preaching of Paul and Barnabas at Iconium reflects the same thinking. The apostles declared the word of his grace, a message of transforming power. Luke says, the Lord authenticated by granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. Church leaders at Antioch, sending out Paul and Barnabas, entrusted them to God's grace that they might do the work God has assigned them. The leaders did the same for Paul and Silas, handing them over to God's grace. In these examples, Acts associates grace with power to preach the gospel and perform signs and wonders. Continuing on tomorrow. And the verse to leave today in Psalm 139, 23 and 24, it says, search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. And that's going to the video. Thanks for watching. And until next time again, viewers, in every way, God's way is always the best way.